IPTV Presents Conversations with Presidential Candidates, hosted by DMACC, has been funded by Goldman Sachs, which is delivering its 10,000 Small Businesses program in Iowa to help entrepreneurs across the state create jobs and economic opportunity. Additional funding has been provided by the Arlene McKeever Endowment Fund, a fund at the Iowa Public Television Foundation established by a gift from the estate of Arlene McKeever. And by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation. The future of the American presidency and our nation's economy are key factors in the 2020 race. In Iowa, the nation's first test for presidential aspirants, candidates face questions directly from voters, searching for answers impacting the lives of students, small business owners, and everyday Iowans. From Des Moines Area Community College in Ankeny, Iowa, IPTV presents Conversations with Presidential Candidates, hosted by DMACC. Here is Iowa Public Television's David Yepsen.
Welcome to the latest edition of our IPTV Conversations with Presidential Candidates, an in-depth focus on issues relevant to the future of our country and candidates seeking the Democratic nomination for president. All hosted here at Des Moines Area Community College. We'll dive into a series of issues, many dealing with ways to improve the economic lives of Americans. Our goal is to help people make a crucial choice in the months ahead. The questions will come from me and from Iowans seated in our audience of students, business owners, and Iowa caucus goers. We're joined now by former Vice President Joe Biden. Before 2 terms in the Obama administration, Senator Biden served the state of Delaware for 36 years in the U.S. Senate. Mr. Vice President, welcome back to Iowa and welcome to this conversation. It's great to have you here.
And I knew in 1973 you'd be a legend. You're really good, David, really.
Anyway. Appreciate you being here. Let's go right to the edge of the news. Today, the Trump administration announced some new immigration rules. They're proposing to indefinitely hold families who cross a border without documents, as opposed to now there's a 20-day limit on that. What's your reaction to this?
My reaction is unnecessary. I think it's, for example, when families come across many are seeking asylum, many not eligible, but they're seeking asylum, they're entitled to a hearing. They're entitled to be determined whether or not they meet the criteria for asylum. We found when we did that letting people not be put behind bars or in a cage, families separated or even held together, that they showed up for their hearings. They didn't go. But think about what this president has done. Everything about immigration he's done to try to scare people, to try to worry you all. There's an invasion coming. There's an invasion coming up from through Mexico. Mexicans are rapists. I mean, it has been, to me, there is no rationale based on necessity for what he's doing. And it's making us in this country look like, not resemble who the world thinks we are. And it hurts us internationally. And lastly, David, if we want to do something fundamentally about what's happening, we got to go look at the source of why people are coming, particularly from Central America. That's why at the end of our administration, I was able to put together with a number of Republicans and Democrats a program for $750 million to say to the countries in question, Guatemala, El Salvador, and to go in and say, and Honduras, and say, look, if you do the following things, if you reform your police force, if you provide better education, if you collect taxes, if you do this, we will give you this money. We will help you reestablish and establish for the first time democratic institutions so people don't leave. The president has walked away from that. You have to look at the source, the reason, and you have to be humane in the way in which we deal with this. I think it's all about politics. I don't think it has anything to do with protecting our border.
Just to follow up, do we need to redefine what it qualifies for asylum in the
well,
U.S.?
I think we have to redefine how you can seek asylum. You are able to come across the border and say, I want to come across, I'm seeking asylum, and get a hearing. But now the president has decided you can't even, if you're going to pass through one country to get to our country, you have to seek asylum in the country you pass through. That's never happened before. You know, and I don't know how in God's name back in, you know, in 1849 when my ancestors were getting on coffin ships in the Irish Sea to come to the United States. Really, I mean, how would people have gotten here? Not many of you, I guess. I can't see the audience, it's dark, but, you know, the fact of the matter is that it takes, you know, for people to decide to pick up and leave everything they know to come to a place that is obviously now not very welcoming, where they don't speak the language, or they have to decide how they're going to make it. It takes a lot of, it's not done haphazardly. It's not done because they, in fact, think, won't this be fun? It's done because they have a problem, and they deserve to have a hearing as to whether or not they are eligible for asylum.
Should crossing the border without documents be a criminal matter, or should it be a civil matter?
I think it should stay the way it is. I think it should stay as a criminal matter. It's a misdemeanor. But I don't think that is something that is dispositive of why this president's doing what he's doing. It allows you to, in that circumstance, make your case why you should stay. You should be able to have a hearing, and you should be able to make the judgment, be heard as to whether or not it's appropriate for you to stay under the immigration laws. What we have to do, were I elected president tomorrow, the first thing I do is send an immigration bill to the United States Congress, and I think we get it passed this time because people are realizing exactly, we came close last time, realizing how lopsided we are in the way we're dealing with this. We're in a situation where we should legalize dreamers. The idea that a 5-year-old kid says, "Mommy, leave me on this side of the Rio Grande. I'm not going over. I don't want to break the law." I mean, come on. These people are here. They're become American citizens in terms of their attitude. You know, Teddy Roosevelt talking about what we talk about, Americanism. What makes you an American? You adopt the basic notions of free play, openness, you know, fair play, I should say. And anyway, so I just think it makes no sense to go about it the way we are.
I want to switch gears. Electability. One of the issues that I hear from a lot of Iowa Democrats is they want somebody who can win. That's a very important issue to them. Why are you the person who is most capable of getting to 270 electoral votes against Donald Trump?
Well, that's a tough question to answer. It sounds awfully presumptuous for me to answer that, but let me put it this way. Every one of us in the Democratic Party, all 400 of us running, now all of us running, we all have visions that fall within the same general spectrum. But none of it matters unless we defeat Donald Trump. None of it. We can handle 4 years of Donald Trump. It'll be hard to make up for all the mistakes that we've made and how we've been moved backwards instead of forwards, nationally and internationally. But with 8 years, there'll be a fundamental change, I think, in who we are as a country. And so I think that for the first time in my career, the person viewed as who is best capable of defeating this president rises above the test of I have to agree with the person 100%. Now, one of the things that I know some of my opponents, and they're good people, they're all qualified good people, say is that, well, we don't have to go out and elect those people who left the Democratic margin, the Democratic Party last time. We don't need them. We'll just do what we did before, go out and get identity politics. Well, I've done very well in states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and states like Minnesota, Colorado, Virginia, Florida. I've always, that's been the source of my support, even when we've campaigned here in Iowa for the president and I. So I think that I have, look, I'm called middle-class Joe. They don't call me that because they think it's a compliment. It means you're not that sophisticated. But I know who built the country, and it's people from the backgrounds like I come from, and my dad and my mom and so many people out there that given half a chance, they can do anything. And I think we'll see. This is what campaigns are about. It's a marathon. I think that I have as good a chance or better than anyone to be able to win in those states. And no Democrat has ever won the presidency of late without winning Pennsylvania. And so it's my home state, my native state, not my home state. And I think I think I could do well.
Let's switch to some issues of concern to middle-class
Yes.
Americans and jobs in the economy. What are the most important things you think need to be done to create more good jobs?
Well, the first thing we have to do, and it's going to sound like avoiding your question, but you've heard me speak about this before. We have to change the corporate culture in this country. We got to a point where there's an economist from New England, his name is Lazanick. He wrote a piece, and he pointed out that from 2002, I think it was, or 2003 to 2012, corporate profits were doing very, very well. And what they did was they bought back roughly 25% of their, they gave a dividend to their stockholders, made up 35% of the profit they had. And I think it was 54, don't hold me to that, 54% they bought back their own stock, reinvested in themselves. They had only left them roughly 9% when it was all done to be able to invest in worker training, worker pay, worker benefits, or expanding their markets. It's this short-termism. Finally now, even some serious CEOs of companies are saying, we got to change that. I have a cartoon in my office that's a picture of a big rotund guy wearing a black turtleneck sweater and a black mask and a black cap, and he's being interrogated. And on the table, there's a great big bag with a burlap bag with a dollar sign on it. He's saying, I'm sorry, I didn't know he was a job creator. Because think of what's been adopted. Milton Friedman's notion that the only obligation a corporation has is to their taxpayers. Is to their stockholders. But they owe the taxpayers a lot. They owe their employees a lot. And when I came here on campus, David, several years ago to set up a program which it's called a TAC program, where we came out and provided a significant amount of money to get this community college and others around the country to go out and partner with businesses to be able to provide the work that the training that was necessary and it was needed. I did a study for the president, and I asked me to do the future of American jobs. We found out there are 100,000 jobs out there in the manufacturing area, high tech, that people weren't qualified to have because they didn't have any training. So we brought in the money, and we started to. And then this college, and my wife's back in school for the first day today at Virginia Technical Community College. She used to teach at Deltech, We've partnered with these colleges, and what they did was they went out and they partnered with organizations and businesses and said, look, we need this many workers to do this, and they got trained here at school. But the bottom line is this. All of a sudden it hit me. Why in God's name is the government doing this? Why aren't the corporations reinvesting? And it's because of this notion that they give everything back to the stockholder, and or now you have over 40% of the pay is in stock options. So that's why they buy back their stock.
How do you force corporations to do that?
Well, three ways you do that. First of all, I would push the SEC to change the rule. There used to be a limitation on how much of your stock you could buy back. So you could reinvest so there's money to reinvest in expansion and jobs and job training, et cetera. Secondly, we should be put in a position where we start to tax wealth, not just work. We should provide work as should be giving the benefit. For example, capital gains. The capital gains, 20%, I would double them to the 39.5% because there's no indication they're creating any new jobs. What they're doing is, but they're taking money out of the economy that could be invested in education, could be invested in job training, could be invested in a whole range of things, and it would provide billions of dollars. And so there's a lot of things we're able to do, but guess what? Corporate America is figuring out. The Business Roundtable is now saying, wait a minute, this short-termism is hurting us. One of the leading CEOs of a major company today announced that there's an obligation they have. He said, if you want to make capitalism work, pay workers more. No, I'm serious.
Speaking about paying workers more, and talk about the minimum wage. A lot of talk about raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. In rural communities, like we have here in Iowa, people will tell you if you do that, you will destroy jobs. that $15 is too high for some businesses to pay in rural communities, that people work those jobs, they need that income. So what do you say to somebody in rural America who may say, great, raise the minimum wage, but it's just going to be a job killer for us here in rural America?
Well, first of all, that argument's been used overall for no matter where you are. They're saying it's a job killer. There's no evidence that it kills jobs. What we have to do in rural America is we have to reinvest in rural America. For example, one of the reasons why rural America is not able to attract businesses, because a significant portion of all the investment capital is going into 7, 8 cities, it's not going to rural America, is because they don't have the infrastructure available. If we invest in infrastructure, for instance, we should be putting $20 billion into extending broadband across the board because companies aren't going to go, even small businesses aren't going to go to rural America unless they have the same tools available to them in fast time as other companies. That's why I strongly argue, and we did in our administration, but I would increase it, investing in minority-owned businesses and small businesses, particularly in rural America. That's why I think we should be doing things like making significant investments in rural America as it relates to carbon capture and creating jobs that provide for not only increasing environmental security, but at the same time creating good paying jobs. And so it's a multi-pronged thing. But the truth of the matter is that I think that no one should work 40 hours a week and live in poverty, period. And so I just think it's a necessity.
Social Security. To make it sound, you've talked about adjusting the cap on Social Security taxes. Are you talking about eliminating the cap or just raising it?
No, I know this is complicated stuff. I know you all understand it and the audience understands it, but right now we have to do something to increase to be sure that the young people in this audience have Social Security available to them after paying in all these years. Right now, at roughly $125,000, the amount of money you pay, if you can make $1 million, you're only paying the first $125,000. And combined, it's about 12%, a little over you and your employer. That's what makes it solvent or not. The fact of the matter is, if we provide for the same tax on the $125,000 for someone making $1 million, I would make a gap between $125,000 limitation now and $400,000, and everybody above $400,000 would pay the same rate that the guy making $100,000 or $50,000 or $60,000 is making. That would make it our solvent, would not punish anyone who's able to pay, and they're able to pay, and would increase the solvency of the program and give us much more latitude in what we could do within the program to make it more secure and fair.
This cap is adjusted each year. I just checked it. The current one is $132,000.
It's up to,
So it's up to that. But your policy proposal.
My policy proposal is to let it continue to adjust, but increase the amount of those having to pay the full freight, just like the person paying 132 pays, for everybody making 400 or more.
Okay. What about eliminating it on lower wage workers? Make it progressive, make the tax progressive by allowing people who are making low wages, you set the freight, and that would free up money to be spent in the economy, would it not?
Well, it would. That's kind of what we did, as you remember, when I did the Recovery Act for the president.
Right.
We provided a less. I remember someone come up to me and saying, God, I got a pay raise from my boss. I said, no, you didn't. But you got less taken out of your pay because you didn't have to pay as much into the system. But what that doesn't do, it doesn't deal with the solvency issue. Right. And so the way to deal with that is I would propose that those folks who are at the lower end of the scale, getting lower benefits, living longer, they're running out of the benefits they have, and they're going to have to eat into their basic income, sell their homes, sell their property in order to get health care, in order to stay in a nursing home, in order to be able to qualify for so many other things. They have to actually spend down all that they have. And so what I would do is provide for, and I can lay it out if there were time, lay it out, and there's not much time, I know, you see your watch, but the bottom line is that provide for those at the lower end of the spectrum, those spouses who lose their spouse and their Social Security is reduced, compensate them for that by the increased money going into the Social Security system by people over 400.
Let's change gears to another issue, front and center in America today, gun violence. what do you do? And furthermore, secondly, how do you get Republicans in the U.S. Senate to go along with it?
Well, two things. You may remember that the only guy that's ever beaten the NRA is me. In the crime bill, for real. I'm the guy that led the effort to get the Brady bill passed, which had the background checks. That wasn't in the crime bill, but that was before that, number one. We expanded the background checks as well. And I also was able to get passed an assault weapons ban, as well as a limitation of the number of bullets that could be in a magazine. That is, how many bullets you could fire at one time from a weapon. There's no threat to the Second Amendment by telling people there are certain weapons they cannot own. There is no rationale to own a military-style weapon, an AR-15, that if you're a hunter and you need an AR-15, you shouldn't be out there hunting. If you need 100 rounds in your clip, then you're a danger to yourself if you're out there hunting. I'm not joking. And so we were able to get it passed. The way we were able to get it passed, we combined it with other things that were equally important to people. It also had the Violence Against Women Act in it. It also had a number of other things that were good, community policing, et cetera. So I think there are two things. One, I met with each of the almost every single victim of what happened up at Sandy Hook and down in Florida, as well as the Pulse nightclub and so on. And for example, what's changing is this has turned into more of a movement than just a cause. And what's changing is the American people are now in a position where there's overwhelming support for eliminating these assault-style weapons and limiting the number of bullets in a clip. The only person who is still in the pocket of the NRA fully is the president. The president meets with, the head of the NRA, and he says it's a mental problem. I didn't know he was talking about the NRA or he was talking about, because he's cut all the funding for mental health across the board. By the way, that's another. But here's the point. I think that if you take a look at what's happening, when those students from Parkland, I met with them, I was no longer vice president, but I met with them in the Capitol in 18. And they were going off with their parents to meet with members of Congress. And the members of Congress were shaking about not wanting to meet with them. I'm serious. They don't want to meet with them. So what we have to do is we have to take it directly to the members of Congress. Go at them. And there's an attitude change across the country, including NRA members. And I think we can get it done if we have a president who will lead this effort.
You mentioned mental health. We have a question from the audience about health care.
I'm sorry for putting my hands in my eyes. I can't see out there without.
Mr. Vice President.
Yes.
Mr. President. Greetings.
There you are. How are you?
My name's John Hale. I and my wife Terry own and operate a consulting firm focused on aging and caregiving issues right here in Ankeny, Iowa. My question is this. I'm one of 60 million who rely on the Medicare program. One glaring weakness of Medicare is that it does not cover the frequent and the high costs of most vision, dental, and hearing services that are essential to health and quality of life. You've proposed a Medicare-like public option that people could purchase if they wished. Would it cover those services? And if not, why not?
Yes, it would, period. Yes, it would.
Great.
Let me follow up.
I can explain more if you want, but you tell me.
Go ahead if you want to elaborate on
No,
that. Because my question, to follow up on that, your party's in a big argument right now over how to provide health care for everybody. Why is your proposal to expand the ACA, Affordable Care Act, better than people are saying Medicare for all?
Well, let me just speak about my program rather than criticize the other. My program, look, one of the biggest things we did, and the thing I was proudest to working with Barack on, was the passage of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare so-called. And it provided for coverage of over 100 million people with pre-existing conditions. It put us in a position where we provided for 20 million people who never had coverage before. And you could buy into different grades of programs, what you wanted, if you wanted to buy into this and buy other plans if you didn't have one. What we did was, what I propose now, we wanted to do then, was add a Medicare-like option. So anybody who is on Medicaid or eligible would automatically be enrolled in that for free. And secondly, we changed the way in which we subsidize more significantly the amount of money for each of the various programs. You can get by a gold plan, a silver plan, et cetera. You can buy a gold plan, and that means that your deductible is no more than $1,000 if there's something happens to you instead of 5 or 10 or whatever. It covers the issues, the things we're talking about here. But more than that, in addition to the plan, I proposed how we deal with drug cost. Right now, we have, when I did the moonshot on cancer, my son died of cancer. The president asked me to put together an initiative, and we spent over almost 2 years on it, 1.5 years. We made some significant progress. And what we found out was that when you're dealing with the new kinds of drugs that are needed to deal with, for example, cancer and immunotherapy, they're bio-based drugs, they're not chemical-based drugs, and they cost a lot of money. But there's no justification for the money that are being charged by the drug companies on so many drugs. And some of you know what it means when you talk about how they've drastically increased the price of a drug you initially needed, and now it's costing you $100,000 a year or $50,000 or whatever, or more in some cases. So we would set up a commission in the Department of Health and Human Services where we bring in outside experts. The drug company would have to come, make the case for the new drug they're seeking to have patented, they're seeking to get control of, and that they've developed, and that group would set the price. They set the price based on a reasonable investment that they put into it and a significant profit they could have. And then it would limit the ability of that drug's price to increase beyond the cost of medical inflation. For a period. It would significantly drive down the cost of drugs. I would also, David, eliminate, and because the ability to deduct about $6 billion a year in advertising right now for the drugs they have, and I would go out of my way to see to it we put in jail some of these drug companies who, in fact, for example, they're over, I think it was 8 billion opioid pills. Right. And fentanyl and others that were prescribed in this country. And by the way, if you go to the doc and you have a root canal and they give you a prescription that is basically opioid-based drug, you know, most people, if you use it for more than 5 days, you can get hooked on it. Does anybody tell you that when you go in? Nobody tells you that. And so we also have to deal with the drug side of the cost here as well and have rational policies as to how to rationally allow for significant profit that they can, based on their investment, but rationally.
A quick question on the health care, portability of health care. We're talking about small businesses here. A lot of people want to start a small business, but they can't. They're worried if they do, they'll lose their health care. Does your plan provide them some ability, some portability to leave their current employer and start that new small business? The
answer, it does, and the reason it does, it allows them to be able to rationally and affordably buy into a health care plan under Obamacare, expand it, with this Medicare-like option available to us, and they can choose which plan they want, and it's affordable. It's within their reach. Yes?
Want to change issues? Trade. We have a question from the audience about trade.
My name is Bill Sherman. I live in Des Moines, but grew up in several small towns in Iowa. My question doesn't have to do with trade, but it has to do with agriculture and farming. As you know, farmers are facing a triple whammy. The Trump tariffs have reduced corn and soybean sales. Climate change, extreme weather has produced record flooding, snowfall, rainfall. And finally, our friends at the EPA have undercut the ethanol industry. My question is, what would you do to help the Iowa farmer regain their financial capabilities?
Let's start out with trade, the trade part of that question.
Well, the trade part of that question is that I think that we either are going to write the rules of the road or China's going to write the rules of the road. The fact of the matter is the president's going about this all wrong. The trade deficit wasn't the problem. The problem is China's stealing our intellectual property. They're out there taking big chunks of American intellectual property. The way to deal with that is not by making the American farmer pay for that. And by the way, biggest industry in my state is agriculture. Most people think Northeast, I'm a big industrial guy. It's agriculture. In the Delmarva Peninsula, $5 billion industry, agriculture, okay? So it's a big deal, and I'm fully aware you have to know agricultural policy, and anyway. But the bottom line here is what we have to do is we have to, instead of beating up on our friends and coddling our enemies, we make up 25% of the world's economy. We should get the other 35 to 40% of the world to join us in setting the rules of the road, requiring China to have to engage in fair trade. And it doesn't relate to tariffs, it relates to how they deal with American and other business investments and what they do here and what they steal and so on. And so if we don't do that, they're going to continue to be the biggest, guy in the block setting the trade patterns. If you, in fact, and by the way, I will not sign any trade deal unless labor and environmentalists are sitting at the table, because that's where they beat us up. They beat us up, and we have to rebuild the American economy. If I go to your question quickly, it relates to the trade part of it. One of the things we should be doing is on the dealing with climate change. We should be paying farmers to absorb the carbon from the air into the soil, that you can be the first group of Americans, they can be the first group of Americans that get actually carbon neutral environment. And it's a gigantic issue. I would actually, choose science over fiction here, where they've eviscerated the EPA. My state is only 3 feet above sea level. It is a gigantic issue for my state. You see what's happening out here in the Midwest, not just here, but Nebraska, other states. What's happening is our national security is at risk, because look what happened to 7 of our major bases. And so there's a lot of things that we can be doing that can, in fact, enhance the way in which American farmers can grow and invest. And we ought to be investing in new farmers as well. And the loan program should go from 50 to 100. Anyway, there's a whole range of things we can do that are totally within our wheelhouse.
Mr. Vice President, let me go to one piece of
Okay.
Bill's question, and that is this thing. It's a very important issue locally called EPA waivers.
Yes. Those waivers are a gigantic mistake. Look, one of the things I propose in my climate change plan is we should be investing in what are the new technologies that deal with the follow-ons to ethanol. We should not be exempting, we should be insisting that these major oil companies, in fact, meet the criteria that is set. And what are the new biofuels out there? We should be investing in the federal government instead of giving away tax breaks that make no sense to anybody and don't increase the economy. We should be investing that money. That's no longer a bill. I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong person. But anyway, hi, how are you? I know you're not Bill. Sorry. But at any rate, so look, there's so much we can do. Let me give you, if we change the infrastructure just a little bit, we should be right now, we should be investing in making sure that we have a carbon neutral rural America. Secondly, just imagine, I propose that we have 500,000 charging stations on our highways and rural byways in America, which we can afford by the year 2030, allowing us to own the EV market, the electric vehicle market. Now, if you think I'm crazy, go to any major city in America and see all those scooters that run around. No, I'm not joking. Think about it. This is not rocket science. We have the capacity to do this, but we're not investing in green infrastructure at all. We're not investing in infrastructure that allows people to be able to grow, create jobs, and at the same time, deal with the environment. And there was a third question of Bill, part of Bill's question. I can't remember what it was, but anyway.
No, we could. Let's go to a new question from that person in the audience
All right.
on education.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Mary McClure. I'm a faculty member here at DMACC and parent of a college student. So rising college costs are a concern for me both professionally and personally, obviously. And so I just want to know your plan on how you plan to address and alleviate the soaring college debt, higher education debt for young adults and parents.
As I said, if I didn't have a plan on this, I'd be sleeping alone. I promise you.
Absolutely.
And by the way, I taught in law school for 25 years too, so I have a sense of what's out there. Look, three things. Let's talk about the college debt piece. When the president asked me to do this study for a year on what are the jobs of the future, right now 6 in 10 jobs today require more than a high school degree to get the job. Whether it's a certificate, an apprenticeship, community college degree, whatever. It requires more than a 12 years of education. And so one of the things we should be doing is, they can't because it's dark in here, but if I saw a show of hands, how many people think that 12 years of education is enough in the 21st century to remain in the middle class?
No hands.
No, for real. And so what we should be doing is doing it at both ends. Let's talk about the top end in terms of cost of college. The fact of the matter is, I think community college should be free for anyone who qualifies, and including those who have to come back after technology has cost them their job and they have to be retrained for another job. We can do that, and we can provide for apprenticeships, and we can provide for programs that are available and for certificates to be retrained for jobs like you did here for $6 billion a year. Now, there goes that Biden spending a lot of money, right? $6 billion. There are a total of $1,640 billion in tax loopholes out there. Eliminate one. It's called stepped-up basis. That cost the government $17 billion not collected. It should have been collected the 5 minutes before the individual died. It's a long story, but I didn't know it. Here's the deal. We can put every single person in college, have a community college, cutting in half the total cost of college because all these credits are transferable to a 4-year university. Secondly, student debt. I would change the way in which we deal with student debt. Right now, you have to pay back 10% of your disposable income if, in fact, you've borrowed money and you have a student debt. The average student debt from a public institution is closer to $30,000 a year. That was when you and I started working, not together, but you were, when you were at the register, that could buy you a nice house. That could buy you a house. Now, what are we learning? And you know this, you probably teach it. The fact of the matter is that the millennial generation and those between or graduating from now through the early millennials in their late 30s, in fact, are a reason why they're predicting that we will have a slowdown in our economy because they're graduating in debt, they are downsizing their dreams, they are not buying homes, they are renting, they are not buying new vehicles, and so on. And so what I would do is cut from 10% the required to pay back your disposable income to 5%. If you got out of school and you're making less than $25,000 a year, you would have no debt at all. It would not accumulate. That debt would not gain interest. As you got above $25,000, you began to pay back 5% of that. Thirdly, if you're engaged in public work like you're teaching and or in public service, you would be able to you'd be eligible for a program that in 10 years your debt would be eliminated. And so there's a number of ways to deal with college debt. And I can tell you as a dad who, when my son died, I'm paying off the last bit of his loans for college and law school because, anyway, and he was a successful man. He was Attorney General. He was a decorated Major in the United States Army, et cetera. But that was the deal. And so the debt is severe. It's real. And we should provide for the ability to qualify for, if you're engaged in public service, your debt over a period of time will be totally forgiven.
Mr. Vice President, I want to go back to the climate change issue for a moment. That's a special, and when what you were talking about farmers and carbon sequestration, this is a sensitive issue in rural America
Sure
because of the cattle industry.
Yes.
How do you, we have to reduce methane emissions from animal agriculture, but how do you do that as a practical matter?
With real difficulty. And here's the deal. That's why I think what we should be doing. In my climate change proposal, I call for investing over the time, $400 billion, twice what we did going to the moon, and finding technologies that in fact allow everything from new ways in which to sequester the sequestration of carbon, straight through to other initiatives, so we become a net exporter of technology around the world. We think we can create, and the estimates are 10 million new jobs that pay well. The fact is that it is an issue for cattle farmers. It is an issue. They're not required to move into sequestration, to carbon sequestration, but there's a lot of people with the ground cover and expanding on Tom Harkins's conservation programs that we can make a significant increase. But cattle farming is, in fact, and back in Delaware, there's I don't know how to say it politely on the air, but there's a whole lot of chicken manure. No, I'm serious. And how do you transfer that into usable energy that in fact does not release this methane into the air? And there's a lot of work going on to try to figure out how to do that.
We have another audience question. This one is about budget deficits.
Oh, we don't have any. What the heck? I mean,
sometimes I'm wondering if that's what a lot of the candidates feel. My name is David Clockingay, and I live here in Ankeny, a small business owner, and that is a frustration of mine, is the national deficit. I don't hear either party talking about it right now. I do hear a lot of Democratic candidates talking about raising revenue for such things as college education, health care, but the national deficit's never addressed. And at some point, I keep thinking, shouldn't we pay off the deficit before we start giving back? So what do you have to say about that situation, about the national deficit?
Well, first of all, I am concerned about the national deficit. And you may remember when the president was pushing his tax proposal, which increased the debt by $1.9 trillion above what it was, $1.9 trillion, we're in a position of, I said at the time, he's going to use that as an excuse to try to say, now we got to deal with the debt. What we're going to do is we're going to eliminate the safety net. And you saw what happened when the Republicans still had the House. The first thing the leader of the House did, and the Budget Committee came along and said, we got to cut Medicare by $500 billion, $560 billion. Mitch McConnell said, we got to cut Social Security. We got to cut. Look, here's what we do. I think the way to cut the national debt is cut out some of the ridiculous tax cuts that are out there, and in fact reduce it that way. Let me give you an example. I believe we should, in fact, the capital gains tax should be at what the highest minimum tax should be, which we should raise the tax back to 39.6% instead of 20%. I think the corporate tax rate, which was at 40 or 38%, should have come down to 28, but not to 21%. If we just brought it back up to 28%, we would in fact be in a position where we raised about $600 billion more dollars. I can go down the list of all these existing loopholes that exist in the law of that $1.6 trillion, plus eliminating the tax cuts for the top 1/4 of 1%. They're good people, they're decent people. But the last thing, and I tell them all when I meet with them, and I know that this is being sponsored by a major Wall Street firm. You don't need the tax cut. You don't need it. You don't deserve it. You're doing fine. And so I'm serious. I've been straight up about this for a long time on this. And so the point is that we can bring the budget considerably back into balance, but the ultimate way you build the balance, you bring this back, is you have to provide growth. For example, if we were to eliminate the president's tax cut for the top 1/10 of 1% that exists today, and we provided, for example, child care tax credit. Well, there goes Biden spent a lot of money. But you know what it would do? It would increase productivity 0.8 of 1% a year. That generates over $1 trillion in 10 years, well over $1 trillion. We should be thinking about the tax benefits that we provide for people and whether or not they generate growth, whether they help a small business person actually be able to generate growth. And so I believe that we could eliminate literally, over a period of time, at least $1 trillion worth of these tax breaks, counting the tax loopholes as well as the tax cut that took place, significantly reducing the debt. But we cannot sustain this debt. It cannot be sustained. But the last point I'll make, When the president put me in charge of the Recovery Act, which was almost a $90 billion bill that even conservative economists have pointed out saved us from a depression and was instituted with less than 0.2% of waste or fraud, what we found out was before you start to try to deal with the deficit, you have to deal with growth and how you're going to deal with real growth. What are you going to do to generate an economy that's slowing down? And the way the president today, I heard on the way over here, he's talking about an executive order to reduce capital gains. He has no power to do that. This is not a dictatorship. He can't decide to do that. And it'd be the dumbest thing in the world we could possibly do. Even the Heritage Foundation pointed out that, the conservative think tank, that his great tax cut did not generate much growth at all.
Mr. Vice President, how worried are you?
But it matters. It matters, but it matters by going at it, taking away some of the reasons why this massive debt has accumulated, and grow the economy again in a way that it's not growing for ordinary people.
How worried are you about another recession? And however we got here with this debt, isn't that limit the ability of any president to attack a recession?
No, it doesn't, because if you can eliminate, look, again, it's one thing to cut back spending if I cut back spending for middle-class Americans, because that diminishes growth. That means we're a consumer-driven economy. And the consumer-driven economy means that if you stop spending, the economy begins to shrink, and that leads to recessions. But the tax cuts we're talking about, David, have not grown the economy. Nobody, the wealthy are not out there spending a lot more money. They're not spending it. If I gave everybody in here, to overstate the issue, a $10 tax break, and I gave a millionaire a $1,000 tax break, the millionaire is not going to do anything. He's just going to invest it. He's going to put it back in his bank account. He's not going to create new jobs with that. There's no evidence of that. But you all will go out and you will pay, you'll make sure that you're in a position where you can get a new set of tires, you can fix the faucet in the house, you can keep your child in school, et cetera. And that's what grows the economy.
But Mr. Vice President, the American people have heard Democrats talk like this for some time. We've heard Republicans talk about tax cuts solving our problem. And what the country did was agree we'd do both. Okay, we'd cut taxes and we'd increase spending. Now, what will change in a Biden administration to cut this Gordian knot that you guys, the Democrats, want to invest more on programs and Republicans want to cut taxes?
Well, the Republicans want to cut taxes on the wrong people and the wrong things. And the fact of the matter is, look what we did. We inherited an economy that was losing 700,000 jobs a month. Remember, everybody, my mom used to say the greatest gift God gave mankind was the ability to forget. And then she'd say, because if she didn't, women would only have one child. But all kidding aside, we forget, which is a good thing. Think of what we inherited. We were in the deepest financial recession in the history of the United States of America, on the verge of a depression. So what did we do? We went out and we stimulated the economy, and it started a growth that has never exceeded every other growth cycle in American economic history. And what did we do? The deficit actually came down slightly. And we were talking about something significantly different than what we're talking about now. It was about $2 trillion less than it is today. And it grew the economy. We created jobs. We increased manufacturing. And it started a growth pattern that, in fact, was stymied only by, in my view, the failure of corporate America to reinvest in its workers. And so the fact is that, and again, the vast majority of economists, including conservative economists, say, yeah, it worked what we talked about. So we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So what I will do, I will cut spending on programs that make no sense, and I can list some of them, and on tax incentives that have no social redeeming value. There's no evidence that they generate growth. There's no evidence that they, in fact, increase the economic growth. There's no evidence that they're justified based on anything that remotely approaches reality and fairness. And so, and I think the American public is sort of on to what's happened here. You know, again, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I doubt how many of you really benefited from this last tax cut out there, man? You really got a big bang, didn't you? I mean, it really helped you, especially if you're a small businessman. Come on.
Mr. Vice President, I want to switch gears to another topic, the Supreme Court. Many Democrats, some Democrats are talking about changing the structure of the Supreme Court, adding justices or term limits. You got a lot of experience on the Judiciary Committee. Is this a workable idea? What do you want to do about it?
I think it's a bad idea. Look, one of the reasons why in the Constitution we gave judges, federal judges, lifetime appointments is we said that they should not have to be influenced by outside pressures. They should be able to call it as they see it. The problem is that the last appointments to the court have been very, very, very conservative justices who don't have a very broad view of the Constitution. And I taught constitutional law, separation of powers, for over 20 years. And there is a provision, the basic way it breaks down, as you know, Dave, is between those who think there are the only rights that exist in the Constitution, those are actually enumerated. If it doesn't say in the Constitution right to choose, then it doesn't exist. If it doesn't say in the Constitution that there's a right of privacy, it doesn't exist. But the vast majority of constitutional scholars believe that there is a notion in the Constitution that you have to read the penumbra of all these amendments. And in fact, that's how we get to the point where it doesn't say that you have a right to privacy. But you all know when you ask yourself, why do you have a right to privacy in your bedroom? Or why do you have a right to privacy in your home? Well, you say, well, I'm guaranteed that by the Constitution. There's no place where it uses the word privacy. But the Ninth Amendment says that all of those things that are not listed in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, are still retained by the people. That's why we didn't try to pass a Bill of Rights initially, because Madison and others thought if it did that, what you'd do is you'd leave out something. You'd leave out something, and if it was left out, then it would be assumed that it didn't exist. And so the Ninth Amendment was that provision. That I won't go in, I'm sorry, I'm sounding like I'm back in teaching, but I apologize. But my generic point is this. I will not appoint, and I didn't appoint, and when I was on, I didn't approve any nominee, and I presided over as many Supreme Court justice hearings as anybody in American history, just because I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee and a lot came through at the time. And, you know, that's why I strongly opposed Robert Bork. Robert Bork, if he had been in the court, woman's right to choose would have been long gone by now. And so my point is that I don't think you can start to fool around with changing the structure of the Constitution legislatively. We tried the court packing piece. They tried under Roosevelt. Even Democrats opposed it at the time because it will come back to bite us. It should not be a political football. What I would do is only appoint justices who, in fact, shared a broad view of what the Constitution, in fact, encompasses. And so, because if we go the other route, mark my words, this is going to come back in a big way and become a political football whoever is the president.
Would President Biden have a litmus test on abortion?
I would have a litmus test on whether or not the justice thought that there was in the Constitution a right to privacy. If you, in fact, adopt that notion, it's very difficult to argue that there is not a right under in the decision that was made that exists that says that a woman has a right to choose within the limits of the law that have been passed, the constitutional determination. And I strongly support Roe v. Wade. I think it reflects the basic consensus of all the major religions in saying that, you know, within certain limits, a woman has a right to make a judgment whether or not to carry to term, and the burden increases as time goes on.
Mr. Vice President, we've got less than 2 minutes, and I want to ask you about the role of America in the world and the possibility of you being a wartime president. We've got a lot of young Americans in harm's way. Why do you think you'd be a good wartime president? Well, hopefully because we wouldn't be in war, not being a wise guy. I would immediately, and you know it's now public record, so I strongly oppose maintaining combat troops
in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We have to be able to work with the rest of the world to deal with the existential threats that exist from non-state actors and terrorists. We're not going to be the world's policeman. That's why I was able to help put together a 67-nation consortium to be able to deal with the stateless terrorists. But to plant permanently in countries in the Middle East the notion that we have full-time combat forces there makes no sense to me at this point. And I know every one of these leaders. I've spent hundreds of hours over time dealing with Iraq, Afghanistan, Russia, with Syria, and these are places I know, people I know, and I think that these fall into a wheelhouse where I've operated for the last 25 years, particularly the last 8 years. And look, we have the most powerful military in the history of the world, but we lead by the example of our power, not just the power, not just the example of our power, but the example. We're out there, and it's what we say, what we do. It's our example that leads the world, and it's being trashed. Look what he just did with Putin. He said that Putin, who invaded a free country, broke every international rule and agreement we had with Russia and with and with NATO, invaded Crimea, took it over, occupied it, trying to bring down that government. And the president says, well, I don't know why Obama and Biden kicked him out of the G8. They should be invited back in. What's the story here, folks?
Mr. Vice President, we're out of time.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
It's nice to be with you all. Have hope, man. We can do anything in this country.
I want to thank the former Vice President for joining us for our latest edition of Conversations with Presidential Candidates here on Iowa Public Television. For our audience of Iowans and our entire hardworking Iowa Public Television crew here at Des Moines Area Community College, I'm David Yepsen, and thanks for joining us today.
IPTV Presents Conversations with Presidential Candidates, hosted by DMACC, has been funded by Goldman Sachs, which is delivering its 10,000 Small Businesses program in Iowa to help entrepreneurs across the state create jobs and economic opportunity. Additional funding has been provided by the Arlene McKeever Endowment Fund, a fund at the Iowa Public Television Foundation established by a gift from the estate of Arlene McKeever. And by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation.